The floorboard beneath Dinah's left foot groaned like a dying animal, and she froze with the rope coiled between her hands, every muscle in her body rigid as iron. 2:47 in the morning. The grandfather clock downstairs had chimed its quarter hour 3 minutes ago, the sound carrying up through the sleeping house like a death knell. Now silence pressed against her eardrums, thick, suffocating silence broken only by the relentless screaming of cicadas beyond the windows and the thundering of her own heart. Sweat traced a slow path down her spine, soaking into the rough cotton shift that clung to her skin. The July heat was murderous even at this hour, the air in the third-floor hallway hanging heavy with humidity that made breathing feel like drowning. But the moisture on her palms wasn't just from Louisiana's brutal summer. It was fear. It was anticipation. It was 12 years of accumulated rage finally finding its path toward release. Cornelius Thornton's bedroom door stood 6 feet ahead. Mahogany, imported from some distant place where men like him purchased beauty with money earned from flesh and blood and sugar cane. The brass handle gleamed dully in the moonlight filtering through the hallway window. Behind that door, the master of Thornton Plantation slept off his evening whiskey, probably sprawled across his feather mattress in nothing but his nightshirt, mouth open, snoring like the pig he was. Dinah's fingers tightened around the rope. 3 feet of it, thick as her thumb, stolen from the barn in 6-inch increments over the past 5 days. She'd braided it herself last night in the darkness of the quarters, her hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with hemp and cotton. The knot at each end was secure. She'd tested it. She'd tested it on feed sacks in the barn at 4 in the morning while Patsy kept watch. She knew exactly how much pressure it would take. Another creak echoed from somewhere below, the second floor, maybe. That would be Celia or Ruth. Or Patsy, if she'd finished already. They'd synchronized their approach as best they could, given the impossibility of watches or reliable timekeeping. When the clock chimed the 3/4 hour, they moved. 4 women, 4 targets, and 2 more besides. 6 men who would not see morning. The house seemed to breathe around her, old timber expanding and contracting with the temperature shifts, settling into its foundation with groans and whispers. Shadows pooled in the corners where the moonlight couldn't reach. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once and fell silent. The Mississippi River, 2 miles distant, moved invisibly through the darkness, indifferent to everything happening in this slice of Louisiana nightmare. Dinah had been 32 years on this earth. 20 of them spent in bondage. 12 of those 20 spent on Thornton Plantation, watching Cornelius grow from a young master with his father's cruelty just beginning to show, into a full-grown monster who treated human beings like livestock and felt righteousness while doing it. She'd watched him strike pregnant women. Watched him sell children away from their mothers. Watched him do worse, things she wouldn't let her mind dwell on even now, because rage had to stay cold to be effective. She took 1 step forward. The floorboard held silent. Another step. Her bare feet made no sound against the wood, calloused soles moving with the practiced quiet of someone who'd spent years learning to be invisible. The rope seemed to pulse in her hands like something alive, like it wanted what was about to happen as much as she did. 5 feet from the door now. 4. 3. The brass handle was cool against her palm when she reached for it. She'd oiled the hinges herself yesterday afternoon, part of her regular duties maintaining the master's private quarters. He never looked at her when she worked. None of them did. That's what they'd counted on, that invisibility, that fundamental refusal to see enslaved people as human enough to be dangerous. The handle turned without resistance. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing the darkness of Cornelius Thornton's bedroom. The smell hit her immediately, whiskey and sweat and the expensive tobacco he smoked after dinner. She could hear him breathing, that heavy rhythm of deep sleep, utterly unaware that death stood in his doorway with rope-burned hands and murder in her heart. Dinah crossed the threshold. 12 years of rage, condensed into this single moment. The floorboard creaked again, and this time she didn't care. His eyes opened. 72 hours earlier. The kitchen of Thornton Plantation held heat like a forge holds fire, the iron stove radiating waves that turned the air into something visible, shimmering and alive. Dinah stood at the wooden preparation table, hands moving through the motions of shelling peas she couldn't even see clearly anymore, her vision blurred by sweat and exhaustion and something else, something that had been building for days now like a summer storm gathering on the horizon. Patsy worked beside her, silent except for the rhythmic snap of pea pods breaking open. Celia stirred something at the stove, the wooden spoon scraping against cast iron with mechanical regularity. Ruth sat in the corner, mending linens by candlelight even though it was past midnight and they'd all been working since before dawn. They'd been planning this for 72 hours, in fragments and whispers and stolen moments. Now there were 72 hours left. Before we continue, if you're drawn into this dark chapter of history, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us what historical story we should cover next. Thornton Plantation sat 12 miles north of Baton Rouge, a sprawling empire of misery disguised as prosperity. 3,000 acres of sugar cane stretched toward the horizon in every direction, the tall stalks swaying in whatever breeze managed to penetrate the suffocating Louisiana heat. The main house rose from this sea of green like a white monument to human cruelty, 3 stories of imported brick and cypress wood, with columns that pretended at Greek grandeur and verandas that wrapped around the structure like arms embracing something precious. 247 souls lived in bondage on Thornton land. Dinah knew the number exactly because she'd counted them herself, whispering names in the darkness of her quarters like a prayer or a curse. 247 people who existed as property in the eyes of the law, whose children could be sold away on a master's whim, whose bodies were subject to any violence that pleased their owners. July 14, 1847. The day everything changed. Dinah had held the position of field supervisor for 3 years, a role that meant nothing except she was trusted to drive other enslaved people harder than they'd drive themselves. 32 years old with hands like leather and a back that still bore the scars from her first year on Thornton land, when she'd been foolish enough to look Cornelius directly in the eyes. She'd learned quickly. Survival meant invisibility. Survival meant swallowing rage until it became part of your bones. But everyone has a breaking point. Patsy was 26, assigned to house work because her light skin and delicate features pleased Cornelius Thornton's wife, Margaret, who liked to pretend she was charitable by keeping pretty servants close. Patsy had a 10-year-old daughter named Belle, a child who'd been born into this nightmare and knew nothing else. Belle worked in the laundry, her small hands already rough from lye soap and scalding water. Celia was 29, the head cook, responsible for feeding both the enslavers in the main house and the workers in the quarters. She'd been on Thornton Plantation her entire life, born in the very cabin where she still slept, watching her mother die from fever and her father sold to a plantation in Mississippi. She had a gift for making something palatable from nothing, a skill that kept her valuable enough to avoid the worst of the violence. Usually. Ruth was 38, a seamstress whose fingers could work miracles with needle and thread. She'd come to Thornton Plantation 5 years ago, purchased from an estate sale in Mobile after her previous owner died bankrupt. She had scars on her wrists from shackles, and nightmares that made her wake screaming in a silence enforced by absolute terror. But her hands never shook when she worked. Her hands were steady as stone. These 4 women had existed in the same space for years without being particularly close. Survival on a plantation often meant keeping relationships shallow, because loss was inevitable and attachment was dangerous. But on July 14, something fundamental shifted in the air between them, an unspoken recognition that passed through their separate spheres like lightning finding ground. The overseer was named Wade Hutchins. 41 years old, from Georgia originally, with a face weathered by sun and cruelty until it resembled something carved from rotten wood. He carried a bullwhip coiled at his belt like other men carried pocket watches, and he used it with the casual frequency of someone who'd long ago stopped thinking of his victims as human. Cornelius Thornton paid him $70 a month to extract maximum productivity from enslaved bodies, and Wade Hutchins earned every penny. Cornelius himself was 36, master of Thornton Plantation since his father's death 4 years prior. He'd inherited wealth and land and 247 human beings, and he'd expanded the operation with ruthless efficiency. Tall, clean-shaven, with dark hair graying at the temples and eyes the color of muddy water, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for anything. His younger brother Jasper, 32, served as his second-in-command, meaner than Cornelius, if such a thing was possible, with a taste for violence that went beyond the economic brutality of plantation management into something personal and sadistic. The plantation manager was Robert Drummond, 53, a methodical man who treated enslaved people like livestock requiring optimization. He kept detailed records of productivity, calculated caloric intake versus work output, and recommended whippings with the same dispassionate tone he used for discussing crop rotation. He slept in a ground-floor room of the main house, close enough to the quarters to respond to any disturbance. On July 14, two slave traders visited Thornton Plantation, Eugene Barrett and Nathaniel Cross, business associates of Cornelius who'd come to discuss purchasing 20 workers for transport to Texas. They arrived in the afternoon, bringing with them the particular stench of their profession, the smell of shackles and terror and human beings treated as commodity. The day had been brutally hot even by Louisiana standards, the sun turning the cane fields into a shimmering hell where workers moved like ghosts through waves of heat. Dinah had been supervising the water detail, making sure the field workers didn't collapse and die before harvest, when she'd heard the commotion near the main house. Belle had been carrying a pitcher of water to the veranda where the men sat discussing their transaction. The child's hands were slippery with sweat and condensation. She'd tripped on the steps, a simple stumble, the kind any exhausted 10-year-old might make. The pitcher fell, shattering against the brick, water splashing across Wade Hutchins's boots. What happened next took less than 5 minutes but would echo forward through time and blood. Wade had grabbed Belle by her hair, dragging her down the steps while she screamed. Patsy came running from inside the house, maternal instinct overriding every survival lesson she'd ever learned. Wade ordered her to hold still and watch. He tied Belle to the whipping post near the barn, the same post where they tied everyone, seasoned with stained dark from years of use. The first lash opened the skin on Belle's back. The second made her scream in a way that didn't sound human. By the fifth, she'd stopped screaming and started making a low keening sound that was somehow worse. Cornelius Thornton sat on the veranda with his brother and his business associates and his manager, watching this happen while drinking whiskey and discussing crop yields. When Patsy begged him to stop it, he'd laughed and said the child needed to learn respect. Wade Hutchins delivered 15 lashes to a 10-year-old girl for the crime of being clumsy. Dinah had been standing at the edge of the cane field, close enough to see everything. She'd watched Celia emerge from the kitchen house, frozen in the doorway with a mixing spoon still in her hand. She'd watched Ruth appear around the corner of the barn, her face gone completely blank in the way it did when horror exceeded capacity for reaction. 4 women. 4 separate locations. 4 minds breaking in the same moment. When Belle was finally untied, unconscious and bleeding, Patsy carried her daughter toward the quarters. The men on the veranda had already moved on to other topics. Wade cleaned his whip. The world continued spinning as though nothing significant had occurred. That evening, after the supper dishes were cleaned and the masters had retired to the parlor for cigars and cards, Dinah found herself in the kitchen. She didn't remember walking there. One moment she'd been in the quarters, staring at the wall of her cabin. The next she was standing in the oppressive heat of Celia's domain, watching the cook stare at nothing while water boiled over on the stove. Patsy arrived minutes later, moving like a ghost. Ruth came last, slipping through the door with the silence of someone who'd spent years learning to be invisible. They stood in that sweltering kitchen, 4 women who'd endured years of systematic brutality, who'd swallowed rage and grief and terror until their insides were more scar tissue than flesh. They didn't speak at first. They just stood there, breathing the same air, acknowledging what had broken inside all of them simultaneously. Finally, Dinah spoke 2 words that would set 72 hours of careful planning into motion. Enough now. Patsy's hands were shaking. Celia's jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out like rope. Ruth's eyes had filled with tears that wouldn't fall. "They're having drinks Wednesday night," Celia said quietly. "Eugene and Nathaniel are staying through the week. All 6 of them. In the house together." The implications hung in the air between them. 6 men. 6 targets. One night. "We'd hang for it," Ruth whispered. "We hang eventually anyway," Dinah replied. "Or get sold. Or work to death. Or worse." She looked at Patsy. "Your girl survives another whipping like that?" Patsy's face crumpled, then hardened into something sharp enough to cut. "No." "Then we do it," Dinah said. "Wednesday night. All of them. We do it clean and we do it quiet and we make damn sure none of them wake up Thursday morning." Celia nodded slowly. Ruth's tears had stopped, her expression settling into something frighteningly calm. Patsy looked at each of them in turn, seeing her own broken reflection in their faces. "How?" she asked. Dinah unwound the rope she'd been using as a belt, letting it coil between her hands like a snake. "We plan. We prepare. And we practice." The cicadas screamed outside. The Mississippi River moved invisibly through the darkness. In 72 hours, 6 men would die. The conspiracy had begun. The greatest challenge was time, or rather, the complete absence of it. Enslaved people on Thornton Plantation worked from first light until darkness swallowed the cane fields, then continued working by lamplight on whatever tasks the masters deemed necessary. Sleep was rationed like food, doled out in insufficient portions that left everyone perpetually exhausted. Privacy didn't exist. Every moment was observed, every movement tracked, every absence noted. They had to plan a coordinated murder in fragments measured in seconds. The first meeting happened in the wash house on July 15, less than 12 hours after their kitchen agreement. Dinah had been assigned to supervise the laundry detail that morning, which gave her legitimate reason to be present. Patsy was there doing the actual washing, her hands raw from lye soap and still trembling with residual shock from watching her daughter's whipping. When Ruth arrived with a basket of linens that needed mending, it looked like normal business. Celia came last, bringing cornbread for the workers, a kindness that would raise no suspicion. They had perhaps 90 seconds before someone would notice 4 people standing idle. "Tonight," Dinah whispered, her hands still moving through the motions of sorting clothes. "Barn. 4 in the morning. We plan everything then. Robert walks the grounds at 3:30, Ruth said quietly, needle already moving through fabric. Checks the quarters for runaways. 4:15 then, Celia corrected. After he's done. Before dawn work starts. Patsy nodded, scrubbing a shirt with mechanical intensity. Belle can't know. Nobody can know. Nobody will, Dinah promised. The entire conversation took 43 seconds. Then they dispersed back to their separate spheres, 4 women moving through the rhythms of bondage while revolution gestated in silence. That night, Dinah lay in her cabin staring at the ceiling, listening to the breathing of the 3 other women who shared her space. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Her mind kept running through possibilities, obstacles, the 1,000 ways this could fail and end with all of them dangling from ropes, the legal kind, the kind used for executions rather than murder. At 4:15 in the morning, she slipped out of her cabin and moved through shadows toward the barn. The July heat persisted even in darkness, humidity making the air feel solid. Cicadas provided covering noise, their relentless screaming drowning out the sound of her footsteps. She reached the barn and waited, pressing herself against sun-warmed wood, watching for any movement from the main house or the overseer's quarters. Patsy arrived first, materializing from darkness like a ghost. Then Ruth, moving with the careful silence of someone who'd survived by being forgettable. Celia came last, slightly out of breath, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Inside the barn, moonlight filtered through gaps in the walls, creating bars of pale illumination across hay bales and farm equipment. The smell of horses and leather and old wood surrounded them. They huddled in the back corner, behind feed sacks, where anyone glancing in wouldn't immediately see them. Rope, Celia whispered, unwrapping the cloth to reveal 18 inches of hemp. Stole it from the equipment shed. Need more, but can't take too much at once or Wade will notice. Dinah took the rope, testing its strength. Need 12 feet total. 4 pieces, 3 feet each. Can you get the rest? By Thursday. 6 inches at a time, different locations. Keys, Ruth said quietly. She produced something from her pocket, a lump of soap pressed into a rectangular shape. Got into Cornelius's study yesterday to repair curtains. He left his key ring on the desk for maybe 2 minutes. I pressed this one. She pointed to the indentation in the soap, the clear outline of a skeleton key. It's for the back entrance of the main house. The servant's door. Patsy stared at the soap impression with something approaching awe. You can make a working key from that. Thomas in the blacksmith shed owes me a favor, Ruth said. His daughter needed a dress for Sunday service. I made it without asking for anything. He'll do this without questions. When? Dinah asked. Tomorrow night. He works late on Thursdays preparing horseshoes for Friday. I'll bring him the impression after supper. We need to know the house layout, Patsy said. I work there, but only ground floor and second. Never been to the third where Cornelius sleeps. Jasper's room is second floor, east side, Celia offered. I bring him breakfast sometimes when Margaret is being particular. Robert sleeps ground floor, west wing, the guest room near the library. Eugene and Nathaniel, they're in the second floor guest rooms, north side facing the river. Wade? Dinah asked. Overseer's house, separate building, Patsy said. But he often passes out in the second floor smoking room when he drinks heavy. Wednesday nights he always drinks heavy, cards with the masters. They were silent for a moment, calculating, visualizing. 6 men, spread across 3 floors of a house they barely knew, in darkness, with no margin for error. We need to practice, Dinah said finally. She looked at the feed sack stacked against the barn wall. We practice the actual killing. We practice until our hands don't shake and we can do it in complete darkness without thinking. Over the next 3 days, they stole time in molecules. 30 seconds behind the smokehouse, where Dinah demonstrated the proper way to loop rope into a strangling configuration. 2 minutes in the root cellar, where they discussed timing, who would go first, how long each killing would take, what to do if someone woke. 45 seconds at the well, where Ruth explained she'd need to unlock the door at exactly 1:15 in the morning, that she'd oil the hinges on Wednesday during her regular cleaning duties. If this story has you gripped, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss our deep dives into history's most chilling true events. Comment below with your thoughts so far. Each morning at 4:15, they met in the barn. They used the feed sacks as practice targets, refining their technique until it became mechanical. Dinah would approach from behind, loop the rope around the sack, and pull with controlled force. They timed it, 8 minutes of sustained pressure to ensure death, no mercy, no hesitation. Patsy practiced until her arms ached. Celia learned to move silently across creaking floorboards. Ruth's naturally steady hands became steadier still. Close calls punctuated their preparation like warning shots. On Tuesday morning, Jasper Thornton walked into the barn while they were still there, arriving earlier than expected to check on a horse. The 4 women had perhaps 3 seconds to scatter, Dinah grabbing a pitchfork and pretending to muck stalls, Celia heading toward the chicken coops visible through the back door, Patsy and Ruth diving behind a haystack and praying. Jasper walked past Dinah without even glancing at her, that fundamental invisibility holding firm. He spent 5 minutes examining the horse, during which Dinah's heart hammered so violently she thought it might be audible. Then he left, and they remained frozen for another 10 minutes before daring to move. That afternoon, Wade Hutchins noticed the rope burns on Dinah's hands, fresh marks from practicing strangleholds on rough hemp. He grabbed her wrist and held it up to the light, examining the raw skin with narrow eyes. "What's this from?" he demanded. "New rope on the irrigation pulley," Dinah said, keeping her voice flat, empty. "Hasn't been broken in yet. Tore my hands up getting the sluice gate open." He stared at her for a long moment, searching for deception. She kept her face carefully blank, projecting nothing but exhausted compliance. Finally, he released her wrist with a disgusted grunt and moved on. She didn't allow herself to shake until he was 50 yards away. Wednesday morning arrived with suffocating heat and brass-colored sky. The day felt suspended, time moving strangely, both too fast and too slow. Dinah worked the fields with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere, running through the plan for the 100th time. Patsy moved through the main house like a ghost, memorizing every creak in every floorboard. Celia prepared an elaborate supper, knowing the better she fed them, the more whiskey they'd drink afterward. Ruth oiled hinges with such thoroughness that Margaret Thornton actually complimented her work. That evening, they drew straws to determine assignments. They did it in the kitchen after the supper dishes were cleared, working quickly while the masters laughed in the dining room. 4 pieces of straw, cut to different lengths, held in Celia's fist. Dinah drew the longest. Cornelius Thornton. The master himself. Patsy drew second. Wade Hutchins. The man who'd whipped her daughter. Celia drew third. Jasper Thornton. Cruelty personified. Ruth drew shortest. Robert Drummond. Cold calculation made flesh. Eugene Barrett and Nathaniel Cross, the slave traders, would be handled by whoever finished their assigned target first and could assist. They stared at each other in the lamplight, for women who'd been strangers days ago, now bound together by conspiracy and rage and a plan that would either free them momentarily or kill them permanently. "No going back now," Dinah said quietly. "Never was any going back," Patsy replied. The clock struck 9. In 4.5 hours, they would unlock the door and enter the main house. In 6 hours, 6 men would be dead. The Louisiana night pressed against the windows, thick with humidity and cicada song and the weight of accumulated injustice finally finding its release. They dispersed to their quarters to wait for the appointed hour. None of them would sleep. None of them expected to survive the week. But they would have Wednesday night, and Wednesday night would be theirs alone. The Mississippi River moved through darkness 2 miles away. The sugar cane rustled in night breezes. The house settled into its foundation with familiar groans. Everything was ready. 72 hours of preparation was about to become 6 hours of methodical murder. 11:47 in the evening. The grandfather clock in Thornton Plantation's main hallway chimed its final quarter hour before midnight, each note resonating through the structure like a funeral bell. Dinah lay on her pallet in the quarters, staring at the ceiling beams barely visible in the darkness, listening to the sound fade into the thick Louisiana night. Her 3 cabin mates breathed the heavy rhythms of exhausted sleep around her. They didn't know. Nobody knew except the 4 of them. She counted her own heartbeats, measuring time in the space between pulses. Across the compound, Cornelius Thornton was still awake. She could see lamplight from his 3rd-floor window casting yellow squares onto the ground below. Jasper's window was already dark. The visiting slave traders had retired an hour ago, their drunken laughter finally ceasing around 10:30. Dinah's hands rested on her stomach, rope burns stinging with every small movement. In 90 minutes, those same hands would loop rope around Cornelius Thornton's throat and hold it there until he stopped breathing. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt only a cold, crystalline clarity. 1:13 in the morning. The lamplight in Cornelius's window finally extinguished. Dinah waited another 15 minutes, letting the house settle into deeper sleep, letting the whiskey fully take hold in their blood. At 1:28, she rose from her pallet with movements so careful they barely disturbed the air. She stepped over sleeping bodies, eased the cabin door open 1 inch at a time, and slipped into the night. The heat was obscene even at this hour. Sweat bloomed immediately on her skin as she moved through shadows toward the barn. Cicadas screamed their relentless chorus, providing acoustic cover. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to navigate by, dark enough to hide in. She reached the barn and found the others already there, 3 women shaped from darkness and deadly purpose. Ruth held up the skeleton key, moonlight glinting off crude metal. She'd collected it from the blacksmith that evening, tested it twice in the lock before supper. It would work. It had to work. Robert walked the grounds at 3:30 yesterday, Ruth whispered. If he keeps to pattern, we have until 3:15 before he might notice anything. More than enough time, Celia said. Her voice was steady but her hands trembled slightly as she accepted her length of rope from Dinah. 3 feet of hemp, ends knotted, broken in through days of practice on feed sacks and fence posts. Patsy said nothing. She simply took her rope and coiled it around her palm, eyes gone distant and cold. Dinah recognized that look, the place you went inside yourself when the world became too much to bear, when you had to become something other than human to survive. Patsy had gone to that place and wasn't coming back until this was finished. They moved toward the main house as a unit, keeping to the darkest paths, avoiding moonlit spaces. The building loomed against the night sky, white columns ghostly pale, windows like empty eye sockets. Every window Dinah had walked past 1,000 times in daylight now looked alien and threatening. Behind those windows, 6 men slept, completely unaware that death approached on bare feet. Ruth reached the servants' entrance first. The door was set into the back of the house, away from the main entrance, designed for invisible people doing invisible work. She slid the key into the lock with hands that didn't shake despite everything. The mechanism turned with a quiet click that sounded deafening in the silence. She'd oiled these hinges herself 8 hours ago. The door swung inward without a sound. They stood at the threshold, 4 women about to cross from one world into another. Once they entered, there was no retreat, no explanation that would save them. Discovery meant death, but then, their entire lives had been a slow death anyway. At least this death would be theirs to choose. Dinah entered first. The interior of the main house was darker than outside, moonlight not penetrating the heavy curtains Margaret Thornton insisted on keeping closed. The air smelled of tobacco and whiskey and expensive wood polish. Dinah's eyes adjusted slowly, shapes emerging from blackness, the hallway stretching toward the front of the house, the staircase rising into darkness, doors leading to ground floor rooms. Robert Drummond's room was 20 feet to their left. Ruth moved toward it like a ghost, rope already configured in her hands. She paused at the door, pressed her ear against wood, listening. After 30 seconds, she tested the handle. Unlocked. The hinges made the faintest whisper as the door opened. She disappeared inside. The others waited in the hallway, counting heartbeats. Dinah had her hand on Patsy's shoulder, feeling the tension in the younger woman's muscles, the barely controlled fury vibrating through her frame. Celia stood utterly still, barely breathing. 8 minutes passed. Then Ruth emerged, closing the door behind her with the same careful silence. Her face was unreadable in the darkness, but her hands were shaking now, rope hanging loose between her fingers. She said nothing. She didn't need to. 1 down. They moved toward the staircase. Each step was a potential betrayal, old wood, prone to creaking, impossible to predict which boards would remain silent under their weight. Dinah went first, testing each step before committing her full weight, moving with the painful slowness of someone defusing a bomb. The others followed in single file, maintaining distance so their combined weight wouldn't stress any single board too much. The second-floor hallway stretched in both directions. North side, Eugene Barrett and Nathaniel Cross, the slave traders, sleeping off their business discussions and whiskey. East side, Jasper Thornton, probably passed out in his usual drunken stupor. West side, the smoking room where Wade Hutchins often collapsed after card games, too intoxicated to make it back to his own quarters. Celia broke off toward the east, moving toward Jasper's room with purpose. Patsy headed west, hunting Wade with single-minded focus. That left Dinah and Ruth to handle the slave traders. Dinah approached the first door on the north side, pressing her ear against it as Ruth had done. Inside, she could hear snoring, wet, rattling sounds of someone deep in alcohol-soaked sleep. Eugene Barrett. The man who bought and sold human beings the way other men bought livestock, calculating profit margins on suffering. She tried the handle. Locked. She felt Ruth move close beside her, felt the other woman press something into her hand, a thin piece of metal, flexible enough to manipulate a simple lock. Where Ruth had acquired this skill, Dinah didn't know and didn't ask. Some knowledge was earned through suffering too private to discuss. Ruth worked the lock for 45 seconds that felt like 45 years. The mechanism finally surrendered with a soft click. The door opened. The snoring continued, undisturbed. Eugene Barrett lay sprawled across the bed, still fully clothed except for his boots, one arm flung over his face. The window curtains were open, moonlight painting everything in shades of silver and black. Dinah could see his chest rising and falling, see the whiskey bottle on the nightstand, see the ledger on the desk where he recorded his human transactions. She moved to the bed with her rope ready. Up close, she could smell him, sweat and tobacco and something sour, like rotting fruit. This close, she could see the details of his face, the gray in his sideburns, the broken blood vessels across his nose from decades of drinking. She looped the rope around his neck before he could wake. His eyes snapped open immediately, pupils contracting as consciousness returned with brutal suddenness. His hands came up, grasping at the rope, at her arms. He was strong, stronger than the feed sacks she'd practiced on. His body bucked and twisted, trying to throw her off. She held on, wrapping her legs around his torso to anchor herself, pulling the rope tighter with every ounce of strength in her body. He tried to scream. The rope prevented it, allowing only a wet gurgling sound that wouldn't carry beyond the room. His fingers clawed at her hands, breaking skin, drawing blood. She felt the warm wetness but didn't loosen her grip. 8 minutes. That's what they'd practiced. 8 minutes of sustained pressure. His struggles grew weaker at the 5-minute mark. At 6 minutes, his hands fell away from the rope, twitching uselessly. At 7 minutes, his entire body went rigid in a final convulsion. At 8 minutes, he was still. Dinah held the rope tight for another full minute, making absolutely certain. Then she unwound it slowly, checking his neck for a pulse. Nothing. Eugene Barrett would never buy another human being. She looked toward the door and found Ruth standing there, having watched the entire thing. Ruth nodded once, confirmation, support, solidarity. They moved to Nathaniel Cross's room together. This door was unlocked. Cross lay on his back, mouth open, snoring loud enough to wake the dead. The irony wasn't lost on Dinah as she approached with her rope. This killing was faster, Cross never fully woke, transitioning from drunken sleep to death with barely a struggle. Ruth helped hold his legs still while Dinah worked. 9 minutes start to finish. 2 down. 4 remaining. They returned to the hallway and found Celia waiting there, her face pale but composed. She held up 3 fingers. 3 dead. Jasper Thornton had joined his manager and the slave traders in whatever afterlife awaited them. That left Cornelius Thornton, the master himself, and Wade Hutchins, the overseer. Patsy hadn't returned from the West Wing yet. Dinah felt a spike of alarm. Had something gone wrong? She moved toward the smoking room with Celia and Ruth following, but before they reached it, Patsy emerged from the darkness. Blood spattered her dress. Her knuckles were scraped raw. But her eyes were clear and calm. Wade fought, she said simply. He's done now. 4 down. 2 to go. The grandfather clock downstairs chimed twice, marking 2 in the morning. They'd been in the house for 47 minutes. The hardest part remained. Dinah looked at the staircase leading to the 3rd floor, to Cornelius Thornton's private chambers. The master's domain. The heart of this plantation's evil. I'll do this one alone, she said quietly. No, Patsy said immediately. We're together in this. Too much noise, too much risk. I go alone. You three wait here. If you hear trouble, you run. We don't run, Celia said firmly. Dinah looked at each of them, these three women who'd become sisters in conspiracy, bound by shared rage and shared purpose. If this goes wrong, she said, don't let them take you alive. She climbed the stairs to the third floor alone, rope coiled in her bleeding hands, 12 years of accumulated rage finally finding its target. The floorboard beneath her left foot groaned like a dying animal as she approached Cornelius Thornton's door. The handle turned. The door opened. And his eyes snapped open, recognition dawning in the moonlight. Cornelius Thornton's eyes went wide in the darkness, pupils dilating as his mind struggled to process what it was seeing. An enslaved woman. In his bedroom. At 2 a.m. With rope in her hands. The impossibility of it seemed to freeze him for one crucial second, long enough for Dinah to close the distance between door and bed, long enough for her to be upon him before his whiskey-soaked brain could organize a response. He opened his mouth to shout. She was faster. The rope went around his throat before sound could form, before his hands could reach the pistol he kept in his nightstand drawer. She pulled tight, using every muscle in her body, 12 years of field work translating into strength he hadn't anticipated. But Cornelius Thornton hadn't survived to become master of a 3,000-acre plantation by being weak. His hand shot out, connecting with her jaw hard enough to snap her head sideways. Stars exploded across her vision. His other hand clawed at the rope, at her arms, strong fingers digging into flesh. He bucked underneath her, trying to throw her off, his body all thrashing limbs and desperate strength. Dinah held on. She'd practiced for this. She'd known he would fight. She wrapped her legs around his torso the way she'd rehearsed on feed sacks, using her body weight as anchor. His fist connected with her ribs, once, twice, 3 times. She felt something crack but didn't loosen her grip. He rolled, taking her with him, slamming her back against the floor. The impact drove air from her lungs but her hands remained locked on the rope. They rolled again, crashing into the nightstand, sending the oil lamp tumbling. It shattered against the floor, glass scattering, oil spreading in a dark pool that reflected moonlight like spilled mercury. His struggles were weakening. For minutes now. His hands still grasped at the rope but with less coordination, less purpose. His legs kicked out, catching the bed frame, making it scrape against the floor with a sound that seemed catastrophically loud in the silence. 5 minutes. His eyes bulged, bloodshot and desperate. He stared up at her and she stared back, letting him see her face clearly for the first time in 12 years. Letting him recognize her as a human being in the moment of his death. Letting him understand, finally, that enslaved people were neither docile nor forgiving. Martha, Dinah whispered against his ear, naming a woman he'd sold away 5 years ago, separating her from 3 children. Esther. A woman he'd whipped for protecting her daughter from Jasper's attention. Thomas. A man worked to death in the cane fields 3 summers ago. Ruth. Not their Ruth, but another Ruth, before their Ruth, who drowned herself in the river rather than endure one more day of his ownership. She whispered names for all 8 minutes, a litany of the dead and destroyed, making sure his last conscious thoughts were of the people he'd brutalized. His struggles ceased at 7 minutes. At 8, his body went completely still. At 9, she was certain. Dinah unwound the rope slowly, checking for pulse at his neck, at his wrist. Nothing. Cornelius Thornton, master of Thornton Plantation, was dead by the hands of a woman whose name he'd never bothered to learn. She stood on shaking legs, her entire body one massive bruise. Her ribs screamed with every breath, definitely cracked, possibly broken. Blood ran from her split lip and the gash above her eyebrow where his ring had caught her. But she was alive. He was not. The asymmetry of that fact felt like justice. She opened the bedroom door to find Patsy standing in the hallway, rope still in hand, ready to enter if needed. Behind her, Celia and Ruth waited, tense as bowstrings. "It's done," Dinah said quietly. 6 men. All dead. The impossible accomplished. They stood in that third-floor hallway for a long moment, for women who'd just rewritten the fundamental power structure of Thornton Plantation through violence and rage and methodical murder. The grandfather clock downstairs chimed 3 times. They'd been inside the house for 94 minutes. "We should go," Ruth whispered. Before Robert's 3:30 patrol, she stopped, remembering. Robert wouldn't be doing any patrols. None of them would. "No," Dinah said slowly, an idea forming. "Not yet." She led them down the stairs, through the darkened house, their bare feet silent on imported carpets. They moved through rooms they'd cleaned 1,000 times but never occupied, past furniture they'd polished but never sat in, under chandeliers they dusted while standing on ladders, always temporary visitors in spaces that defined their bondage. Dinah pushed open the door to the parlor, the room where Cornelius conducted business, where he entertained guests, where he sat in his leather chair and smoked cigars while discussing the buying and selling of human flesh. She walked directly to that chair and sat down. The leather was soft, broken in by years of use. The arms were smooth under her rope-burned palms. She could smell tobacco embedded in the fabric, whiskey residue in the crystal decanter on the side table. From this chair, Cornelius Thornton had ruled 247 lives with absolute authority. Now she sat in it, and he was dead upstairs with her fingerprints bruised into his throat. Patsy understood first. She moved to Margaret Thornton's chair, the smaller one with needlepoint cushions, positioned slightly behind and to the side of the master's seat, always secondary, always subordinate. She sat down slowly, as though the chair might reject her, might recognize her as unworthy. When it didn't, when it simply held her weight like any other furniture, something shifted in her expression. Celia took the chair near the window, the one where Jasper usually sat during business meetings. Ruth settled into the settee, sinking into cushions she'd restuffed herself just last month. They sat in their master's chairs while the house settled around them, while the dead cooled in their beds upstairs, while the impossible reality of what they'd done began to fully register. "They'll kill us for this," Ruth said quietly. "Not a question. Simple fact." "They were killing us anyway," Celia replied. "Just slower." Patsy stared at her hands, turning them over in the faint light filtering through the windows. "Belle," she whispered. "What happens to Belle?" The question hung in the air like smoke. They'd killed the masters, yes, but that didn't free anyone. It just created a vacuum that would be filled by other white men with whips and guns and the full weight of law behind them. By morning, the militia would come. By afternoon, trials, if you could call them that. By evening, executions. And the children, the 247 people still in bondage on this plantation, would face collective punishment for what 4 women had done. "Maybe we should run," Ruth said. "We have until dawn. We could make it to the river, maybe steal a boat." "Run where?" Dinah asked. "North is 1,000 miles through slave territory. Mexico is even farther. The swamps." She shook her head. "We'd be caught in a day." "Then why are we sitting here?" Patsy demanded, anguish creeping into her voice. "Why aren't we at least trying?" Dinah looked around the parlor, at the oil paintings of Thornton ancestors scowling from the walls, at the imported rug beneath their feet, at the wealth accumulated through human suffering surrounding them on all sides. She thought about Martha and Esther and both Ruths and all the others whose names she'd whispered into Cornelius Thornton's dying ear. "Because," she said slowly, "I want to sit in this chair and watch the sun come up. I want one morning where I'm not in the quarters, not in the fields, not bowing my head and saying, 'Yes, master.' Just one morning." Celia reached over and took Ruth's hand. Ruth took Patsy's. Patsy reached for Dinah's, completing the circle. They sat like that, four women holding hands in their dead master's parlor, waiting for dawn. Through the windows, they watched the sky gradually lighten from black to deep blue to pale gray. The cicadas' nighttime chorus gave way to morning birdsong. Somewhere in the quarters, people would be waking, not yet knowing that the world had fundamentally changed overnight. Dinah stood and walked to the sideboard, where crystal decanters held expensive whiskey and imported brandy. She poured 4 glasses, the good crystal, the kind enslaved people were forbidden to touch except when cleaning. She handed them out. To Belle, Patsy said, raising her glass. May she live to be old. To Martha and Esther and all the others, Celia added. To one night of justice, Ruth whispered. To us, Dinah said finally. For being brave enough to take it. They drank the whiskey. It burned going down, harsh and expensive and tasting like stolen freedom. The grandfather clock chimed 5:30. Dawn was perhaps 20 minutes away. Soon, the house servants would begin arriving to start breakfast. They would find the bodies. The alarm would sound. The machinery of retribution would begin its inevitable work. But for now, in this stolen moment before the world woke to what they'd done, 4 women sat in their masters' chairs and allowed themselves to feel something they'd never felt before, powerful. Dinah walked to the window and looked out at the cane field stretching toward the horizon, at the quarters where 243 people still slept, at the sun beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of orange and gold. They'll tell stories about this night, she said quietly. They'll say we were monsters. Devils. Animals who turned on their betters. Let them, Patsy said, joining her at the window. We know what we are. What's that? Ruth asked. Dinah watched the sun continue its rise, burning away the darkness, illuminating the plantation in harsh morning light. In less than an hour, this brief moment of power would end. But for now, it belonged to them entirely. Victorious, she said simply. The 4 women stood at the window together, watching their last sunrise as free actors in their own story. By nightfall, they would likely be dead, hanged or shot or burned as examples to every other enslaved person in Louisiana. The brutality of the response would be calculated to inspire terror, to prevent anyone from ever attempting something like this again. But they had claimed one night. One night where 6 men who dealt in human misery faced consequences for their actions. One night where the natural order of Thornton Plantation was inverted, where the powerless became powerful, where justice, rough and bloody and imperfect, was extracted by the very people who'd been denied it by law and custom and violence. The sun cleared the horizon, and morning came to Thornton Plantation. History would record what happened next with brutal efficiency. But this moment, this stolen hour of sitting in masters' chairs and drinking from crystal glasses and watching dawn break as something other than property, this moment belonged to Dinah, Patsy, Celia, and Ruth alone. They had no regrets. If this story left an impact, subscribe for more untold histories, and let us know in the comments what you think about this moment in 1847. The morning sun climbed higher, its light flooding the parlor where 4 women sat in chairs they had no legal right to occupy, in a house they had no legal right to enter except as servants. The whiskey glasses stood empty on the mahogany side table, reflecting prismatic light through cut crystal. Outside, the plantation was beginning to stir, distant sounds of movement from the quarters, the first stirrings of another day that would begin like every other day had begun for 243 people still living in bondage. Except this day would be nothing like the others. Dinah heard it first, footsteps on the gravel path leading to the main house. Heavy boots. A man's stride. Probably James, the elderly man who tended the main house garden, arriving early as he always did to water the roses before the heat became unbearable. In approximately 3 minutes, he would enter through the kitchen door. In 5 minutes, he would notice the unusual silence, the absence of Celia preparing breakfast. In 7 minutes, he would investigate. It's time, she said quietly. The 4 women stood together, facing the parlor door. They didn't run to the servants' exit. They didn't attempt to hide or create alibis or pretend innocence. They simply stood, waiting for discovery, having already decided that these final moments of agency were worth whatever followed. The sounds from outside grew closer. Footsteps on the porch. The front door opening. James had a key for emergencies, and the unlocked servant's entrance would have alarmed him. His voice calling out uncertainly, "Master Thornton." Something wrong with the kitchen door. His footsteps in the hallway. Approaching the parlor. Then stopping dead in the doorway as he saw them, four enslaved women standing in the master's parlor, wearing the evidence of violence on their hands and clothes, making no attempt to hide. James was 67 years old. He'd been enslaved his entire life, first in Virginia, then sold south to Louisiana 30 years ago. His eyes moved from their faces to the empty whiskey glasses to the rope burns on their hands. Understanding dawned slowly, followed immediately by fear. "What have you done?" he whispered. "What we had to," Dinah replied calmly. "They're upstairs. All of them. Thornton, Jasper, Wade, Robert, and the two traitors. They won't be waking up." James's face went gray. His hand gripped the doorframe for support. "Lord have mercy. They'll kill everyone for this. The whole plantation. He couldn't finish the sentence, horror stealing his words. "They'll kill us for," Dinah said. "Maybe. Probably. But they won't kill everyone. Too much money invested. They'll want to make examples of us, but they won't destroy their own property over it." "You don't know that," James said, his voice breaking. "You don't know what they'll do." "No," Patsy said quietly. "We don't. But we know what they were doing. We know Belle is upstairs right now with whip marks that might never heal. We know Martha's children were sold to Texas and she threw herself in the river. We know Thomas died in the fields and nobody even stopped work to bury him properly. We know, James. We know exactly what they were doing." The old man's eyes filled with tears. "There are children here. Babies. What happens to them now?" "The same thing that was going to happen anyway," Celia said, her voice hard. "They'll be worked and sold and brutalized just like we were. Just like you were. Just like everyone has been. We didn't make that world, James. We just refused to live in it for one more day." James looked at each of them in turn, seeing something in their faces that made him step back. "I have to raise the alarm," he said finally. "You know I have to." "We know," Ruth said gently. "We're not asking you to protect us. We're not running. Do what you need to do." He hesitated for one more moment, then turned and fled, his footsteps rapid and uneven as he ran toward the overseer's house, and then presumably remembering Wade was dead, changing course toward the nearest neighboring plantation 3 miles away, where white men with guns could be summoned. The 4 women listened to him go. They had perhaps an hour before the militia arrived. Maybe 2 if James had to go all the way to the next plantation. "We could still run," Ruth said, without conviction. "No," Dinah replied. "We sit here. We wait. We let them find us exactly where we are, doing exactly what we did. No shame. No apologies." They returned to their chairs. Patsy fetched the whiskey decanter and poured another round. If they were going to die for the crime of drinking from the master's crystal, they might as well actually drink from it. The logic was circular and perfect. The morning continued its progression. More sounds from outside, voices now, confused shouts, people discovering that something was wrong. The absence of the overseer. The locked main house. The growing sense that the normal order had been disrupted in some fundamental way. Dinah thought about Belle, about whether the girl would understand why her mother had done this, whether she'd be proud or terrified or some combination of both. She thought about all the children on this plantation, the ones who would grow up hearing the story of the 4 women who killed their masters. Some would remember them as murderers. Others would remember them differently. Celia stood and walked to the writing desk where Cornelius kept his business ledgers. She opened the top drawer and pulled out the thick leather-bound book where he recorded everything: purchases, sales, births, deaths, all the accounting of human property. She carried it to the fireplace, struck a match from the mantel, and set the ledger ablaze. The flames caught quickly, pages curling and blackening, years of meticulous record-keeping turning to ash. The smoke rose up the chimney, carrying away names and prices and calculated profits from human suffering. "They'll just make new ones," Ruth observed. "I know," Celia said, watching the fire. "But these specific pages, this specific record of these specific people, it's gone now. That's something." They heard horses in the distance. Multiple riders approaching at speed. The militia, probably, or the neighboring plantation owners, or both. Armed white men coming to restore order and extract vengeance for the unthinkable crime of enslaved people killing their masters. "I'm not sorry," Patsy said suddenly, her voice clear and strong. "I want that said. I want it on record somewhere. I'm not sorry we did this." "Neither am I," Ruth added. "Not for 1 second," Celia confirmed. Dinah stood and walked to the center of the parlor, positioning herself where she'd be clearly visible when the door opened. "Then we face whatever comes next with our heads up. We don't beg. We don't cry. We don't give them the satisfaction of seeing us broken." The horses were close now, hoof beats loud on the gravel drive. Shouting voices. The sounds of men organizing themselves for violence. The front door burst open, they'd kicked it in rather than waiting for keys. Heavy boots in the hallway. Multiple men, all talking at once, voices overlapping in confusion and rage. The parlor door flew open. 6 white men entered with rifles raised, faces flushed with anger and fear and the particular fury of people whose fundamental worldview had been challenged. They stopped short when they saw the 4 women standing calmly in the middle of the room, making no attempt to resist or flee. "Which one of you?" the lead man started. "All of us," Dinah interrupted. "We all did it. Together. Cornelius Thornton, Jasper Thornton, Wade Hutchins, Robert Drummond, Eugene Barrett, and Nathaniel Cross. All dead. By our hands. With rope. While they slept." The men stared at her, momentarily stunned into silence by the calm directness of her confession. They'd expected denial, excuses, pleading. They hadn't expected 4 women standing proud with blood on their hands and no regret in their voices. "You'll hang for this," one of them finally managed. "Probably," Dinah agreed. "But they're still dead. That doesn't change." What happened next unfolded with the brutal efficiency of a system designed to maintain control through terror. The 4 women were shackled immediately, chains heavy on their wrists and ankles. They were dragged outside into the growing morning heat, where a crowd had gathered, enslaved people from the quarters, neighboring plantation owners, curious whites from Baton Rouge drawn by the news of something unprecedented. They were taken to the barn and locked in the tack room while the white men organized themselves, decided on jurisdiction, argued about whether to conduct a proper trial or simply execute them on the spot. Through the walls, Dinah could hear fragments of conversation, debates about legal procedure, concerns about setting precedent, calculations about property loss and insurance claims. In the tack room, the 4 women sat on the floor, chains connecting them to iron rings in the wall. The space smelled of leather and hay and horse sweat. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the boards, creating bars of light across their faces. "No regrets," Patsy whispered. "None," the others answered. The historical record of what happened to Dinah, Patsy, Celia, and Ruth has been lost to time. This story, while fictionalized, echoes documented cases of enslaved resistance throughout the antebellum South, moments when human beings pushed beyond endurance chose violence over continued submission. Margaret Garner, who killed her own child rather than see her return to slavery. Celia, who killed her enslaving rapist after years of abuse. The participants in Nat Turner's rebellion, who rose up against impossible odds knowing the consequences would be brutal. These stories are difficult. They're uncomfortable. They involve violence that challenges easy moral categorization. But they deserve remembering, not to glorify the violence itself, but to acknowledge the impossible choices forced upon people living under a system of absolute oppression. The 4 women in this story committed murder. By the laws of 1847 Louisiana, they were guilty beyond question. But those same laws classified them as property, denied them personhood, and provided no legal recourse against the violence inflicted upon them daily. In a system that offered no justice, they created their own. History tends to remember enslaved people as either passive victims or noble resistors who achieved freedom through acceptable means. The truth was far more complex. Some resisted through escape. Some through work slowdowns and sabotage. Some through violence. All of them resisted with whatever tools were available, knowing that survival itself was an act of defiance in a system designed to destroy them. The sun continued rising over Thornton Plantation on July 18, 1847, illuminating a world forever changed by one night of coordinated rage. 6 men were dead. 4 women had claimed a moment of terrible power. And somewhere in the quarters, Belle would grow up knowing her mother had refused to accept the unacceptable. The story doesn't have a happy ending. History rarely does. But it has truth in it, the truth that oppression cannot be sustained indefinitely, that human beings will eventually choose death over continued subjugation, and that justice delayed becomes justice taken by whatever means necessary. Remember their names, even the fictionalized ones. Remember what was done to them and what they did in response. Remember that this happened not in ancient history but in America, in Louisiana, in living memory of people whose grandchildren are still alive today. Remember that resistance takes many forms, and judgment belongs to those who never had to make such impossible choices. The 4 women sat in their chains, waiting for whatever came next, and remained unbroken to the end.